I hope everyone has stayed healthy and well, and just doing well during this time. I want to just welcome you to our June webinar on COVID-19. We want to bring panelists here to you to give you insight and their thoughts on where we've been over the last couple months and where we can expect to go. As our moderator, we have Tim Sullivan with Myers Research. We have Mark Cafferty with EDC, and then we have Norm Miller from UC San Diego, or University of San Diego. So with that, I want to turn it over to Tim Sullivan and allow him to kind of introduce the conversation that we're going to have today, as well as the panelists. Thanks. On to you.
Thank you, Brooke. Appreciate that. And I think everyone on the call heard Brooke's opening about abnormal conditions. And after the last 13 weeks, it feels like abnormal has become normal. We're going to explore that today. And you're very fortunate that we have two terrific speakers. Both of these gentlemen are my industry friends, and also they're terrific economic thinkers. Both of them have different responsibilities, but you'll find that they come together in what they think about and what they're concerned about. Our first speaker today will be Norm Miller, and Norm's official title is the Hahn Chair of Real Estate Finance at University of San Diego. But I actually look at him as one of the economic minds that I can understand. Along with Ali Wolf, who is my partner at Myers Research, Norm just has a terrific capability of putting things together in an easy to understand way, but you'll find a very thoughtful way, and perhaps most important, realistic. And he'll be accompanied by Mark Cafferty. And Mark Cafferty's title is President and CEO of San Diego Regional Economic Development Corporation. But what you need to know about Mark is that Mark is really the business person who is trying to hold on to every single part of San Diego County's business community, speak with them, connect with them, and really keep the energy and the juices flowing. You're going to benefit from what he has to say, and he's got some interesting personal perspectives too about the impact of COVID and a perspective on the business side. So Norm, why don't we start with you, and we'll go through some of your concepts and topics. From there, we'll jump into a conversation with Mark. Norm, my friend, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And I'm happy to give a little bit of an overview here. And if you bear with me, there we go. So I'm going to give a quick overview. I'm going to go too fast to spend much time on the details of a series of slides, but this will set the stage for our discussion afterwards. Here are some conclusions up front. Real estate's still a robust investment alternative, but it's going to take an income hit. And let me move this over to here. And it's going to take an income hit and a value hit. And we're going to need new protocols and some retrofitting. A huge danger on the horizon for those of you in California is more and more legislation like SB 939 and 828 summer votes. And we'll touch back on that later on. And there's a few silver linings. Here's the big picture. The places that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic are the tourist markets and the oil-based economies. We're probably getting close to 45 million unemployed or underemployed at this point because 1 out of 5 of the early applicants were turned down. I think what's really telling will be two things. One, if you look on the right side, notice how correlated we are with education. And you can tell that the ones really being hit by the unemployment rate, because this is an outdated unemployment number, just wanted to show you the correlation with degrees. Those with less than high school or only high school are really getting nailed, of course. And the other point to keep in mind is that we have this huge stimulus going on right now through July. It's likely to be extended. I'm not sure how long. My guess would be into the fall sometime, but this is a moral hazard slowing down the recovery somewhat. Employment does drive the net operating income for the different property food groups, and we see that a 1% change in employment has a negative effect on retail and multifamily of about the same amount in the same year, and a lagged effect typically on office and industrial property, but with even greater impact. Naturally, this would be permanent changes in employment, and that's one of the questions, but this is a very significant effect. If we look locally, and this is from Sandag in April of this year, the dark areas on the map to the right are those hit hardest by unemployment. And let me take about one more month, and I thought it was strictly South County and a little bit east, but here's what it looks like as of May 9th. And there are pockets that are just fine along the coast, Del Mar, La Jolla, Rancho Santa Fe, but the entire county is getting nailed with some significant unemployment rates. In terms of the residential market, just by way of overview, our normal listings look something like this, and instead we've been down here. Now they're starting to come back a little bit, but they're still way down. We already had low supply, so we have a very unusual market, low supply and low demand. It's a little bit hard to predict prices in a market with low supply and low demand, but the low interest rates has been helping that market a little bit. One of the big questions, are we going to shift from the high rise to the less dense, the high cost to the lower cost areas? In terms of property at risk, most at risk, as you would expect, would be these, and least at risk. And I'm just going to fly through these, and we'll come back to this. Least at risk. Now, the key questions include how much are rents down, how much are values impacted, what about distress, protocols, design changes, what changes will we see? And let me just give you a little picture. Oops, too fast. These are the rent collection declines that we've seen already by property type. And of course, hotels and retail are the worst by far. And this is kind of as you might expect. Let me look at the value impacts. And this is also the trends that you would expect in terms of the implied value impacts on commercial property. Now, not everybody agrees on these numbers, and there's a range of estimates depending on who you look at, but this is based on the implied values, based on the typical ratio to REIT prices. In terms of distress, one of the interesting things is that we've seen 47 billion already accumulated looking for distress and 121 funds. 20 billion has been pulled out of the market. Last recession, we saw similar numbers at this point in time. And the ones that are likely to be distressed are the high leverage private owners, hotels, retail, and multifamily, those that went high leverage, or those that borrowed CMBS money because loan modifications are just not possible with the CMBS funds. There's going to be some single family distress when the unemployment benefits run out, especially in those markets hit harder by unemployment. So South County in particular is going to be nailed there. And distress could be exacerbated by Senate Bill 939 if it passes, because it essentially prohibits evictions and allows leases to be terminated. Same thing with 828 that allows courts to cut rent. Some of the other things that we're going to see: more cleaning staff, security staff, thermo cameras, tracking software. All real estate's going to operate differently for a while. Cleanliness certifications might come into being. Everybody's going to try to make everything touchless. This is just for fun. This is in Japan, how they're making elevators touchless. You pull a toothpick out of the little styrofoam block there, and then if you use it, you throw it in the cup. I hope we come up with better solutions. And this is our elevator moment. I hope we don't see this. There's lots of new vendors out there trying to tap into this market to clean everything, antimicrobial surfaces, copper and otherwise. Cleaning filters that clean our air much better. And we are going to see some changes by property type. Certainly we're going to see some people continue to telecommute. I think we're going to come back to that. And one of the questions is, are we going to see a demand for larger units, both in homes and in apartments, because of accommodating some people working at home? We're going to need faster communication, 5G, more important, more delivery units. In terms of retail and restaurants, we've accelerated e-commerce by 10 years. Restaurants need to de-densify by 50%. If you've ever gone to Florida during the winter, when you see the early bird specials for the snowbirds, well, imagine the whole country with early bird specials to get us out at 3 and 4 and 5 to spread out that normal restaurant peak, because they're going to try to do enough business that they don't have to go out of business. Less spending, less seating equals higher food prices and less rent. Outdoor patio space is gold. We're lucky we live in San Diego or California. Ghost kitchens are going to continue to increase. And one of the key questions on retail is how to accommodate more curbside pickup. That turns out to be a challenging question for property managers. A little bit more on retail. You know, the old department stores are dead, but some have good real estate. That's a silver lining. A lot of others are in trouble. CVS is adding more medical and optical service, and Target is adding CVS and Starbucks and groceries. So they're going big time after Walmart. The highly leveraged mom and pops are going under. Probably 25% or more of them are going to go out of business. They simply won't be able to hold on. And the last nail in the coffin could be the civil unrest going on right now. And in terms of office, more telecommuting, that's one of the questions. Some of the employers are saying yes. They're probably not the most innovative firms, but you know, call centers and others certainly can work from home. And more staggered flex work schedules are being planned as we speak. Definitely less density, more partitions than we've seen in the past. And the social gatherings will be gone for a while. In terms of the net effect on the office market, less space demanded is what we would see with unemployment, telecommuting, flex schedules, and PropTech and WeWork's been the elixir of addiction, the drug of addiction to a lot of office property landlords. They are significantly cut back. Based on the recession, we can expect that to continue. And then on the other hand, we have more space demanded because of less density, more private offices, plus more offices within mixed-use property. Net, it's probably on the less space side for a couple of years. More space side if you happen to be in a very healthy metropolitan market with strong economic growth. There's still reasons to go to work periodically, even if you work at home some of the time. And in the last 2 months, we have seen landlords audit their tenants to see if they really can pay their rent or not, negotiated new protocols, when to start, stop, how to use elevators, visitor access. Next up, I expect that commercial real estate owners will lobby governments to defer reduced property taxes. And if they have the funds, start to retrofit the buildings, if they have the capital. A key question is what to do if the occupants or visitors do not comply with the new protocols and put others at risk. Are you going to hire security people? Are you going to call the police? Difficult questions. In terms of lenders, they don't want the assets back. So they've been modifying, going to interest-only loans, extending the term. But we can expect the loan of values to become more conservative, probably 60% for office, 50% for retail. So tougher underwriting on the horizon, more cash reserves, and they will require future valuations to consider tenant risk into account. A couple important questions before we get to our discussion with Tim and Mark. Who's going to pay for the improvements in building designs? Is the government forever going to be expected to be a safety net for all households and businesses every time we have an economic calamity in the future? We've never seen a stimulus at this scale that we're seeing today. Will we see class riots as the benefits run out and our economic gap widens? Now, I actually had that question in there before George Floyd was killed. And now we actually have these riots, and the fact that people are home quarantined, so they're not necessarily working, adds to the size and scale of these class riots, of course. So I hadn't anticipated that we'd be seeing them right now, but part of the point here is that there's an economic gap in this country, and it's actually being exacerbated by who's affected by unemployment right now. What are the silver linings? Inflation, mortgage rates are going to stay low for a while. There's some distress opportunities. Some properties are doing well. Construction costs are going to decline for a little bit, although supply has also been cut back. And households are going to keep more savings, and businesses are going to keep more savings next time around, and they're already starting to save. That's good and it's bad in that it slows down the recovery. And building retrofits are going to go through the roof. And working at home some of the time won't make you a second-class citizen anymore, and you don't need to put on a tie as often, or socks in the case of some people. And I will stop there, and hopefully that set up our discussion. And I am happy to turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Norm. And as always, well done. You cover a huge amount of material in a very short period of time. And Mark, I'm going to go back through a couple things that I picked up from what Norm said, and I think it'll launch us well into a conversation. Norm, I want to begin with the end in mind. And you said, looking at commercial real estate, it's robust investment, but it'll take an income and value hit. So to me, that means we've got a time frame that we've got to be patient with in terms of being investors. One of the huge things that you made a correlation for is unemployment and the lower educational levels. If we start to think about one of the solutions, the long-term solutions to the protests and the income inequality, the element comes back to education, because you see that there was a inverse relationship between education and who's lost their jobs. Also, the value shift, for everybody that's listening in today, the value shift that Norm's talking about, remember that's from February to now. It's going to change. It's going to go up and down and up and down. There are some pretty significant shifts, certainly in the lodging side of the world, but just keep an eye on that. Norm, thank you for at least putting a stake in the sand about that. Mark, this is one I want to go to with you as soon as I finish this quick wrap up, and that's the work from home element and what you're hearing from San Diego County employers. Because on one hand, the work from home thing in our organization has already started for the last couple of years. We have people with young children. We have people that have older parents they have to take care of, so they need flex schedules. We already had embraced that. So the concept of adapting to work from home, at least for our organization, Myers Metro Study and Builder Magazine, was working pretty well. And Mark, one of my arguments is going to be that there's always a need for office, although as Norm said, it'll shift because how we use space will be different. And in many ways, think of the office as becoming the clubhouse, literally the place people go to gather, convene, really to interact, because we are still very much a pack animal. We like to have the human beings together. One other thing that Norm said, and I'd love, guys, for us to talk about it, is how we pay for this, because Norm was talking about maybe deferring property taxes, but I know in the work that we've been doing and that Ali Wolf has been driving, a lot of the individual markets are looking at increases in taxes, whether it's property tax, sales tax, pretty much every tax to pay for everything that we're going through right now. So with that, guys, let's jump to you, Mark. Mark, one of the elephants in the room besides protests and the inequality that we've got to deal with across the country is this work from home, WFH. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about what you're hearing from San Diego County employers and where you think we're headed with this, if it's permanent, and if so, what does it look like when it's permanent?
Sure. No, it's a great question. You can hear me okay, correct, Tim? Great.
Perfect. Fantastic.
It's a great question. It's actually something that, as both you and Norm indicated, it was an issue that a lot of folks were tackling and taking on as space was changing across markets well before this. Just using sort of the personal experience of our team at EDC, we're a pretty small team of about less than 25. But immediately around a little bit before St. Patrick's Day, when the stay-at-home orders went into effect, we were quickly able to just transition everyone home. And there's an element of our work that is largely bringing businesses together for major events and functions. We quickly, like so many of you, figured out how much of that can be done via Zoom and online, and how much of it do we just not do anymore? How much of it is not really doable? And every entity like ours, the Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Partnership groups are kind of thinking the same way. But as we made phone calls out to all of our member companies, and EDC has about 200 large businesses who invest in EDC, you kind of heard A to Z, depending on where in the economy you were calling to. You'd hear stories about SDG&E shifting thousands of workers home right away and keeping them there and having no real issues or problems with that, and seeing that for the foreseeable future, they may be able to do that with a lot of their workforce, all the while needing to keep people out in the field who still need to go out and actually engage, whether it's grid-related technology or calls at homes and businesses. But you would see that an entity like SDG&E was busy, maybe busier than ever, keeping us all connected, but was already seeing that they could do an element of their work differently. And then you would talk to someone like one of the major hospitals, and of course they can't work from home. I mean, people are in, right. And those are major employers in San Diego that take up a lot of space, obviously. And while the hospitals have been struggling a bit to see many of us coming in for non-COVID related things, that will change. People will start coming back in, and the hospitals that have taken a bit of a hit will be back on track. But you see right away that sectors of our economy, this has not hit sectors of our economy evenly. And so the directions that people go in, as far as what their work environment is going to look like, what technologies they begin to lean on, we believe is going to look very different and diverse across the region.
I want to jump on something you said related to COVID. You shared offline that your wife is a physician, and COVID is here, and in many ways it may be here to stay. Share with everybody that's on the line with the perspective that you've earned, both hearing companies who are saying, hey, come on, let's open, and then your wife who's on the front line who may have a different perspective. Please share.
Absolutely. No, happy to. And I was telling Tim before the call, so my wife is a physician, and she, for a long time, was a Navy physician. So many of her colleagues are working in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, and they stay very connected via sort of private social media channels where they connect with each other and talk often. And she was seeing in other parts of the country, well before we were hearing how bad things were in New York and New Orleans, just how bad things were getting through the eyes of her peers, through folks working in emergency rooms, through people who were working in the units, and for people who were being pulled away from other specialties to have to, their own specialties to have to do that work. So in a lot of ways, it is somebody who hears from businesses for a living who are very heavy on sort of the reopen element of this. I come home every day to a small business owner now who's a physician who has to think about her patients, who has to think about really making sure that the environment that anyone is walking in is safe for workers and for her patients. And there's a balance that I'm always trying to do in my mind, because I know just how badly this downturn and this stay-at-home order has hit our economy. I hear it from hundreds of businesses every day. I also see through her eyes people who have literally seen thousands of people die, have actually seen thousands of people die just in the city or even in the medical systems that they're in. So we cannot forget that element of it. We're going to have to change a lot of things. I think we'll learn a lot from healthcare. I can tell you that the way that my wife now makes sure that her medical practice is sterilized and safe for people to come into is something that businesses could learn from and borrow from. And I think we'll see more of that as the industries that have had to stay open and work with people have had to think that through, and now can pass those practices along to other elements of the economy.
Right on, Mark. And Norma, I want to come your way and stay on the COVID-19 impact. I flew yesterday for the first time since COVID, and besides the fact the San Diego airport was pretty much a ghost town, when we were getting on the Southwest flight, we had to have face masks. And it really wasn't that big of an adjustment. We were able to take them off to drink a glass of water, but for the most part being very, very careful. When you think about the real estate industry, and whether it's residential or it's the CRE side, what do you think are permanent impacts for us to think about for, let's say on the commercial side, what are permanent impacts that you see from COVID?
Yeah, and I wanted to add that after Mark's comments that my wife's not a physician, but she thinks she is. I get the same lectures. Yeah, well, let's stick with the office market for now, but I see a number of things. You know, there's a lot of people that we could hire if we were willing to have flexible schedules and let them work at home some of the time. And you know, you've mentioned this before, Tim, and I think that we're finally going to do that. So I think there'll be more people that work part-time at home and come in when they need to collaborate and work with others. So this, you know, working in different places without being a second-class citizen, that's a good change, and that's a good trend. And having you know, schedules that start at different times and are staggered, that I think that's great as well. I'm not sure what percentage will be working at home. I think that's one of the questions, and what it's going to go up. But it could have an impact on the vacancy in office buildings. You know, even if it's only 10 or 20% that work significantly from home in the future, and some of the call centers and firms like Nationwide have indicated that they're happy to go with everybody working at home. In terms of the buildings, there's a lot of changes. Mark mentioned his wife's protocol at her offices. We're going to see the same thing in the office buildings. It turns out that we can filter air better than we have. It turns out that we can put in surfaces that are better at killing viruses and bacteria than we have. And I see some of those changes as being permanent. On the other hand, 5 people to an elevator that had 14 before, 2 years from now, I think we're going to go back to, you know, putting 12 or 14 in there again, because we forget. Just like every time there's a hurricane that hits Key West, 2 years later, the real estate market's back. We forget. And so I see some of the protocols being temporary, 1 or 2 years, and others being design changes, flex schedule changes. I see them being permanent. This distancing in restaurants and offices, I really don't know. 2 to 5 years until we forget, and then we start to squeeze in a little bit more. But certainly the buildings themselves, the operation, the elevators, the touchless applications that we put in the buildings, like Open Path that lets you open doors to your office or the building. Once we go down that path, we're never coming back. So buildings are going to get better.
You got it. And I would add from the residential standpoint, both the way that homes are being sold, the sales offices, and the use of the virtual technology to interact with potential buyers has gone 3 years in advancement in 3 months. And the other part of it is I think we're going to be using our spaces a little differently. And Norm, as you said, there's going to be a demand for more square footage, but we have a little bit of an issue called affordability when it comes to either rents or buying a home. So that trade-off on a location and a density is going to be a fascinating one to see, because ultimately housing, at least, is a monthly payment business. Norm, quick question from the audience. There's a couple people that want to make sure, are your slides going to be available after the program?
Yes, I've sent them to Danny and LAI, and it's fine if they share them. And there's some extra materials that I didn't cover, certainly.
Great. Well, I'm sure everybody appreciates that. Thank you very much, Norm. Mark, I'm coming back to you, and this time the concept is tourism. And you saw in some of the openings that Norm had that there's a strong correlation amongst the leisure and hospitality side of the world, where that employment is, and also where we've seen jobs lost the fastest. We have a pretty strong trade here with tourism and travel. Talk to us about what you're seeing and your outlook for that segment of the industry over the next year or two in San Diego.
So it's interesting. I think there's been numerous panels for years now where folks have really kind of talked about the diversity of San Diego's economy over the past several decades. And it's an oversimplified narrative, but you can really break our economy down into a military defense economy, a very diverse innovation economy across biotech and high tech, a lot of local and small businesses. So an awful lot of small businesses. In fact, 95% of our businesses are small businesses. And then tourism, and these becoming sort of the key elements. Throw in the border component, and that's sort of your quick, complete picture of San Diego's economy. But if you take those three economies, military defense, innovation sort of writ large, and tourism, they all employ historically somewhere in the ballpark of about 130 to 150,000 people. If you talk to folks in defense right now, defense contracts have not stopped. In fact, they're continuing to move along, they're continuing to be strong, and that funding will continue to flow. So while things have changed and it's not normal, those companies and that sector of our economy is not taking a big hit. In innovation, things are also different, and there are things that are going to, based on the business models, impact supply chains and things of that nature. However, we'll see that element of the economy sort of stay strong and continue to be innovative. And I think, have not a quick resurgence, but I think a stable resurgence. Tourism has been decimated. And that's not just here, that's everywhere, but we have a disproportionate number of our jobs tied to tourism. And so when you look at that across our economy right now, and then you look at the number of small businesses and restaurants and retail that then thrive because of tourism, or somebody who supplies a hotel in some way, shape, or form through a small business, it has had a significant sort of ripple effect through our community. Those were the individuals who lost their jobs first. They're the individuals who oftentimes are on the lower skill spectrum of our economy. So when we're at 2.9% unemployment and you just couldn't find people, these aren't individuals who, when they lose their job, are going to be able to go out and cross over into 3 or 4 other elements of the economy. They'd be waiting to try to come back to similar jobs. It's not only the place where they lost the jobs first, it is the place that's going to be the slowest in recovering by a long shot. So those jobs will come back latest and fewer, because the business model in tourism will change sort of across the board. One thing that we've been looking at and noticing as a sort of a commonality that we wouldn't have thought of before is foot traffic. Any particular business model that you have, whether it's a dentist's office, whether it is retail, whether it's a hotel, whether it's the ballpark, places where a large number of people have to come in and out for your business model to be successful or convene with each other. These are the places that are going to change completely and significantly, or are going to have the slowest time getting back to recovery as we try to think through the normalcy in our mind of, will we go back to a hotel yet? Will we fly on a plane regularly? Will we go back to a stadium? And the last thing I'll say about those jobs is that they then disproportionately hit our lower income communities, in particular African-American, Latino here in San Diego, only adding to an economic divide that was already pretty epic in our region well before this.
Mark, that's a good connection. And Norma, I want to come back your way. We're going to connect the COVID concept to protests to your outlook. If I start in reverse order, your outlook longer term sounds relatively positive. We've got to burn through, and as you also mentioned, there's a certain element of forgetfulness after time. But with the protests and so many people coming out of lockdown and spreading, being together all over the country, if we have another COVID spike, how does that impact the way you look at your economic projections and the outlook for real estate over the next 6 months to a year?
We probably will have another COVID-19 spike during the flu season. And I think the key question is, will that force us back into quarantine? If the governor does not put us back into quarantine, then the industries that are affected are going to be mostly the ones that Mark was talking about as most vulnerable. The tourist industry, the conferences, any kind of business that puts dense people together. There'll be a lot of fear that'll hurt those businesses when we get another COVID-19 wave coming at us again. But the others are going to be largely unaffected. During the quarantine, CVS was still open, Walgreens was open, Home Depot was still open, all these so-called essential businesses, and that just exacerbated this economic divide between those that were essential and those that were not, even though sometimes they sold the same goods. So it's really unfair to shut things down again if we have another wave, because you hurt all these businesses in a distorted and inequitable fashion. but again, if we have this other wave, I think it's going to be the restaurants and the tourist business that suffers the most. And the rest of the economy, as you said, Tim, was doing just fine before this, and it will do just fine again. But we're going to have a vaccine or something like that before the fears subside. As to the question of the riots, I think that delays everything, and what that does is that symbolizes this economic divide that Mark was talking about, and it personifies it. And I think that we would not have as many people in the streets if everybody was working. But now pretty much everybody has the ability to take some time off and join a protest. I'm not sure what else to say about that. That's certainly going to cause economic strife, and it puts a light on our economic differences and opportunities. And you mentioned education. Clearly, this is a long-term problem that we have that's not going to be solved quickly.
Let's stay on that concept of the impact on real estate. I appreciate what you said, where maybe tourism takes a bigger hit, maybe the commercial real estate, at least for grocery, does a little bit better because there's always going to be demand. We have to be fed. But what about the residential side? Because one of the concerns I have is that there's all this conversation about everyone wants to leave the city. I'm not a believer in that, but that everyone wants to leave the city, move out to the suburbs, have more space. My concern with that concept is affordability, the connections, your social connections, your social fabric of work and family, church that might be in a neighborhood. But share with us your take on the impact for the urban versus suburban world, and then multifamily, because I also think the reports of multifamily's demise are greatly exaggerated. But give us your take.
Yeah, I think it depends on where you live. In some parts of the country, in New York City, I understand people want to move out of the high rises. They're tired of being, stuck in quarantine in those places, and that could be a permanent shift. But here in California, if you want to move to the suburbs, you're talking about the place that is the hardest to get over the obstacles of supply barriers. And so adding supply in our cities has been easiest in California, and adding in our suburbs has been hardest. And so if we do want to move out to the suburbs, it's going to be pretty tough because adding supply there is so much harder. That puts pressure on home prices. If I had a forecast on this, I would say that there'll be a 2-year period that we try to move away from the high rises, and then we slowly forget, and then we go back to the cities again for those that want to be in the city. But there will be a period of time that people will try to move out. We're not going to add a whole lot of supply. We're building less than we did before. And that's one of the reasons why this time the recession was not accompanied by this huge price drop in real estate, as we saw the last time, because we had a reduction in supply of existing stuff. New stuff, the supply is lower, and demand is lower, but interest rates are great. And so it's a little bit indeterminate. I do think we're going to take a hit. It's going to be somewhat masked by things like the stock market and the higher price markets, which won't take a hit, but the lower price markets are going to take a hit probably the end of the year or early 2021. And Tim, I'm sure you have some views on that. I'd be curious to hear them as well.
Well, Mark, I'm actually to come your way. I want to pick up on what Norm was just talking about on how this downturn is different. And two of the obvious things are very low interest rates, and from the housing standpoint, much lower supply. But give us a perspective, stepping back from the economic development standpoint, on what you're seeing being different in this downturn versus the Great Recession, or what's similar.
So it's drastic when you think of the differences. I mean, I heard a stat, I'm going to butcher it. I should have had it kind of better prepared, but in the number of months, and let's say it was 11 months, it took us to lose jobs in the Great Recession that we just lived through and we're coming out of. I heard somebody kind of put a stat out recently where, as a nation, we lost all of that in a matter of 11 to 20 days, just that fast. Now, that's not to say it will sustain and stay that way as long. I think for all the reasons that Norm, I think, has articulated well. But I think, you know, it opens up a bigger issue that we had been trying to think about at EDC with a lot of partners in the community, probably several on the phone, about just how, as a region, when we were in a strong economy, we noticed that that strong economy was still not working for everyone. People could barely get by in San Diego, despite the fact that a guy like me could go out for a living and say that we're at 2.9% unemployment. We have these surging technology sectors. You don't have to look very far from any of us pre-pandemic, pre-economic downturn to find communities that are very disconnected from that economic growth. You throw in the fact that everyone is at home now, and schools are essentially closed and doing their very best to educate people online, and that does not hit households evenly either. The level of technology in a household, the quality of the school that a child attends. Many young people in this region take public transportation to get to and from school when those schools are not in their neighborhoods. How people are going to feel about getting their children back on public transportation or taking it themselves after all this. I think right now we're seeing educational achievement gaps that were already wide growing even more so. And so from a policy side of things, I know we get very caught up on sort of the policies that will stimulate the economy and economic growth. The thing that will stimulate our economy and generate economic growth better than anything is an extremely well-educated population. San Diego has benefited from having a more well-educated population than most of the country, not by a lot compared to most of our peer metros, but holding our own with most of our peer metros. But the more that educational achievement gap slips and widens with the individuals who are growing up here, the more challenging it becomes as we come out of this recession to try to make sure that the individuals are either getting opportunities to train for new industries, or that we're able to make sure that the young people growing up in this region are getting the education that they need to thrive in the sectors of the economy that, you know, I don't want to say anything is recession proof, but are more recession proof because of the skills that you have and the ability to utilize them across multiple businesses and multiple sectors of the economy.
Right on, Mark. And in fact, in home building, to your point about education, education doesn't mean that everybody goes to college. Education means ultimately that we have a better opportunity to expand our capabilities, make more money, start a company. And the Home Building Association in California has BITA, the Building Industry Technology Academy, and they're taking kids out of high school and teaching them the trades. And that's just one example of trying to push it, and I appreciate that greatly. Guys, I want to talk about a vaccine, or a lack thereof. And Norm, I'll come to you next after Mark. But Mark, if a vaccine comes in, do you think it's that we're back to everything is normal, as Norm said? Do we forget like that? Or does a vaccine just maybe speed up the recovery? Tell us what you're hearing from the groups and the companies in San Diego.
So that's an interesting element of San Diego's economic picture as well, as sort of right at the heart of this race for vaccine is our region. So you hear about what's happening in Cambridge, UK, you hear about what's happening in the Northeast, and you hear about what's happening in San Diego. These are the places that are all in the mix, not just to try to get the vaccine, but to come up with the breakthroughs and the things that are helping with everything from how many ventilators we have in our hospitals across the nation to how quickly we could get a vaccine out and kind of mass produced to individuals throughout the US. I think for us to get back to economic normalcy, when you think of that sort of gathering and foot traffic part of the picture that we were talking about earlier, we're going to need to be in a place where people feel like there's a vaccine. You know, we're a country where not everybody will take a vaccine, but if we know that there's one there and the overwhelming majority of people are taking it, then I think that mindset that Norm's talking about is one that we get to quicker. Minus that, we may still get to it. People may still start to see, look, we've just had tens of thousands of people in the streets across the United States over the last few days, on top of each other, yelling and screaming, dealing with all kinds of horrific issues, but packed in nevertheless. 2 weeks from now, we're either going to see a massive spike in COVID-19, or we may see that things are a little bit different as far as sort of the ability for crowds that we've seen out in the streets to weather the contracting of the virus. And we'll have to learn from that. We'll have to watch that and learn from it. But even that will tell us some things that will be helpful for us as we think about how we begin to think of economic normalcy and economic recovery in certain sectors of the economy. I believe we're going to see a few more spikes. And I think that every time one of those spikes happens, we'll have learned from the last. We'll get a little bit better in dealing with it. And then we'll kind of move back into a rhythm of normalcy that will start to work better for certain industries and not so well for others. But seeing that full recovery of tourism, seeing us gather in stadiums again, seeing our airport not be at a 95% drop off in air travel, but back to 80%, 80% full seats on all the flights that are going out of San Diego. That's a long way in the future to me, and we only sort of get there when you have that assurance of the therapeutics that go along with it.
Norm, let's come your way. And Dr. Fauci has been quoted as saying, he thought it was reasonable to expect a vaccine within 18 to 24 months. But you also just heard Mark talk about the fact there's been a race to the vaccine. If we're able to get a vaccine, let's say in the next 3 to 6 months, how does that impact the perspective you've shared with us so far?
Well, even if we do get a vaccine 3 months from now, it's going to take several months to produce enough doses of it to hit 70 or 80% of the population. So we're still 9 months to a year away from now before enough people have that herd immunity for the more conservative among us to venture out. So I think what it means, even if you're optimistic, is that it's going to take a year to 2 years before our economy is even close to being where it was right before this pandemic. And the other interesting question is, most of us were caught off guard by this. This was definitely a black swan incident. Maybe somebody as smart as Bill Gates was not, because he came out saying this could happen. But if I listen to Bill Gates and the scientists, it tells me that we may knock out COVID-19 with a vaccine, but 5 or 10 years from now, we may get another one, and this will happen again. And it will take us some time again to make a vaccine, and that this is going to be a repeated incident. We're going to probably be much better at it next time, but it's going to change our thinking on so many things, including what kind of city do we want, what kind of economic base do we want, what industries are resilient, do we really want to expand the convention center? All those questions come into play if you believe this will happen again. I do believe this will happen again. It might be 5 or 10 years, but it's happened before, and so I think it's going to take some time for us to get back to economic normalcy, and I would say, a year and a half from now would probably be fairly optimistic in terms of, humming along like we were in January and February.
Got it. Well, guys, I'm thinking about the fact that history repeats itself, but each time we experience something new, it's a refresher course. And Norm, I think you're right. I hope that our government and our private sector has learned from what we've experienced with COVID, and we're better prepared next time, and certainly have the infrastructure ready to figure out the next vaccine that we need. Guys, a couple things I was thinking about, also want to cover before we wrap up. And if you're in the audience and you have questions, please send them through the Q&A chat. We'll include them wherever we can, and we'll try to wrap up in a timely basis too. But Norm, I'm thinking from the standpoint of telecommuting, do you think that let me even take a step back. I think we could see an expansion in the value perception and the desire for secondary and tertiary markets. Let's say a Greenville, or maybe a San Antonio, Texas, for people that can conduct their work generally from a distance, and they'll move there because housing is so much less expensive. Do you think that will actually be a true shift that we'll feel, or just a small one?
I think you're hitting it on the nail. I believe it's going to be a permanent shift away from the really expensive markets. The New York City, the Silicon Valley, San Jose, San Francisco, the people that can telecommute and work in the office 2 days a week, they'll move farther out than they would ever consider, commuting on a daily basis. I think that's already begun in markets like San Francisco. And so there are the high price markets where we're probably going to see permanent shifts. Now, how far will we move away? Those that can truly telecommute, I don't know. We're social animals. There's a lot of reasons to get together, but there'll be a certain percentage that move out, 5–10% that spread out, that move far away. They'll just make sure they have good internet and Wi-Fi and they're set. So I do see somewhat of a slight shift for the country as a whole, but a big shift in the really expensive market. So this is going to hurt San Francisco, maybe LA a little bit, New York City, high price markets more than any place else. And it's going to benefit, states like Washington, where they have cheaper housing, in Oregon and Nevada and so forth. So I see some of it as permanent.
I agree with you. I appreciate that. Mark, I'm going to come your way. We've got a question from the audience, and we heard that Norm was identifying industrial as one of the right-hand side land uses where it probably weathers the storm a little bit better. But from your standpoint, what are you hearing? Dig a little bit deeper for us. What are you hearing from our industrial users, the companies that are using that space? They're not immune to COVID, are they?
No, they're not. I mean, I think it's been interesting though, because of how diverse that picture is. But to talk about it a little bit, it's a very resilient picture. And so, in fact, at our upcoming board meeting, we're going to have the head of solar turbines locally here, the CEO of Solar Turbines, and the CFO of Taylor Guitars, both speaking at our next board meeting, both telling pretty positive stories about the ability for Taylor's manufacturing and development operations here in East County and in Northern Baja, and Solar's operations here to be able to continue doing things differently, no doubt, thinking through safety protocols differently, but quickly, but staying as an industry that was deemed essential from the get-go, and that continue to plug along and course correct and figure out how to get better and better at working with sort of a new normal. If you talk to the General Atomicses of the world, if you talk to the NASCOs of the world, you hear very similar things. So as we've talked to the more industrial, manufacturing, sort of heavy development end of who we're working with, it's not to say that those companies and those industries haven't felt this. And I was mentioning before, there may be a staggered effect where supply chains in some way, shape, or form get altered and changed, and that may be for the positive, that may be for the negative, depending on how people feel about sort of their international operations. But I think for the most part, what we've seen on the industrial side is we don't see and hear the heartbreaking stories that we're hearing on the other side. If I talk to the head of NASCO early in the morning, it's a pretty positive picture. If I talk to the owners of Ace Parking in the afternoon, it's a horrific picture. And it's because obviously those are two San Diego businesses that we all know that are just shockingly different in sort of how they do their work. And so I think we're going to continue to see those stronger elements of San Diego's economy remain strong and pivot and do things a little differently and potentially even become stronger. I think where our efforts have to be focused is on how we help on the other side, how we help those sectors of the economy think through their recovery and support them through it, because as Norm said earlier, we're going to lose a lot of businesses on that side, but the ones that are able to maintain and come through it are still not going to come through to a level of normalcy for a while. So I'm hoping that our policy focus in our efforts locally, and even supporting each other locally, trying to make sure that we're buying locally, trying to make sure that we're sourcing things more locally, will become a bit of a trend in every region so that we can try to rally around our own economy as best we can.
Appreciate that. All right, gents, I think what we'll do given time is I've got a separate question for each of you as kind of a wrap up. Then we will get to any further questions, and then we'll call it a day. And Norm, I'll start with you. From the local standpoint, dig into that bifurcation of the land uses again that you see potentially flourishing. And keep in mind two basic things: what we experience now, including the protests and what that means, and then a possible second COVID infection. And then share with us a couple, three of the land uses that you think hold up the best or maybe even flourish.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. As I said earlier, I believe, and I know a lot of my colleagues agree, that what COVID-19 did, it accelerated a lot of trends that were already underway. We were already moving towards e-commerce. We were already moving towards a number of trends that more online learning as an example. And all of a sudden, boom, you know, we're 10 years farther ahead than we thought we would ever be. In that regard, the property types that are doing well were going to be doing well anyway. It's just that now they're booming. So among them, the one that is most positively affected, I would say data centers. Just imagine the traffic of data flowing in your neighborhood and your homes every single night. And, you know, here I am telling my 4 Russian women in the house to get off the internet for a little while so I can have a Zoom conference like this without as much interference. Secondly, micro-fulfillment centers. Micro-fulfillment centers, the kind that are being set up in apartment buildings and at Whole Foods and other places, because the bottom half of the market doesn't always have a good place to safely deliver things. We've seen this surge in micro-fulfillment centers, and we only had a few of them, but I think they're going to surge. You mentioned industrial, the last mile warehouses are doing great. And Mark mentioned life science. I think that we have a lot of life science in the local area, and they're doing great, and they're going to do great because we're going to want them to be working on the vaccine, not just for COVID-19, but anything out there on the horizon, and start early. And so they're going to do great. So that's at least 4 property types that are really going to be doing great. Data centers, micro-fulfillment centers, last mile warehouses, life science, biotech, all doing great. So there are some good property opportunities out there. And then there's some good distress out there. Those department stores going down means opportunities for more mixed use and redevelopment, and there'll be some good opportunities coming out of that.
Can't hear you, Tim.
And it sounded like
Tim might be trying to reconnect here on the sound. I'm not sure if he's using the phone or otherwise. Tim, can you connect through the audio? Well, Danny, who is it that censored? Who is it that censored Tim? I want to know.
Yeah, I think she said something wrong. Our admin must have been offended. I don't know.
Yeah, Gary London said that Tim never sounded better.
Zach is working on Tim's connection, so apologies on that. I know, Mark, he was going to throw it to you. Final thoughts. We've got, we're actually a couple minutes over, but a couple final thoughts from you before we wrap up.
No, I mean, I would just, look, there's heartbreaking stories out there right now when you talk to businesses. There's also remarkably resilient stories when you talk with businesses. I think one of the things I would add to something Norm said in agreement to that picture that he just painted around the 4 or 5 kind of potential land and office and space types that may continue to thrive. One thing, and this is not afforded across the country, but it is afforded in San Diego. I think we're going to see a lot more of our activities move outdoors, at least for a while. And that's one thing that we can do here is to try to be outdoors more, whether that's eating outdoors, whether that's activities that make their way out of the gyms and things of that nature that bring you inside and sort of move you outside. I think we're going to see a shift in that as well. And that's something that San Diego, unlike a lot of regions, is uniquely positioned for year round. And I think that we'll start to see trends that move some of our business models in that direction a lot faster than they would have prior to all of this.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Brooke, I'll pass it to you.
Okay. Well, I just want to close and thank everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for sharing the information. We had over 70 of you participating today, which just shows that there's a lot of hunger and need for the information. So again, thank you to our panelists and for everyone who joined. Apologies for Michelle, our president, not being able to be here. But again, we're glad to be able to do it. And I just appreciate everyone's attendance. We will be holding events next month and in August. We expect next month to be a webinar, and August is a moving target. So we will keep everyone informed. And lastly, we will be sending all the slides out. So thank you so much, and we will see you soon.